Welcome to the Dealing with Goliath podcast. The mission of Dealing with Goliath is to sharpen the psychological edge in business leaders with skin in the game who want to be more effective under pressure, uncover hidden value, and increase profitability. With expert guests across the business spectrum, we deliver gems of wisdom delving into their methods, their thinking and approach to business, life, and to problem solving. This is the Grande Cup of Insight, long-form podcast interview where we take a little bit more time to delve a bit deeper into our guests' experience, stories, and get those priceless nuggets. I'm your host, Al McBride. My guest today is Andrew Wayfinder Hryniewicz. For those who don't know Andrew is an architect, psychotherapist, and shamanic practitioner who's an expert in the psychology of resilience, trauma recovery, and peak performance. Since 2011, Andrew's helped over 175 executives and professionals, from scientists to artists, creatives and writers, use his deep mind methods to become wiser, more creative, fulfilled, and happy in their professional and personal lives. Andrew, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoy the work you do and was really pleased to be invited.
It's great. It's great to have you on the show because we've had a number of conversations in a group that we both attend, and you're always great at giving a very interesting angles of insight to people. You're very generous with your insights. So I hope you can be generous with the listeners today. So let's start off with, talk to us about that change. You went from being an architect to being a therapist and then into shamanism. How did that come about? Was that a very gradual change, or was it sort of you knew you needed to take a different path one day? Talk us through that.
I'm sure we've all had the experience, usually in a relationship, sometimes in a job, where you get that, oh, this isn't going to work out moment.
Sure.
Well, throughout my life, there's been this sort of like inner voice that will, eventually says, this isn't it. Keep looking.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's largely been this kind of inner urge, this inner voice saying, close, but no cigar. So, I went into architecture originally, but, as I finished university, I was really torn between, do I want to go off and become an architect and make beautiful places and make the world more beautiful? And I was very interested in ecological things. Or do I want to go off and become a psychiatrist and work with, people's mental and emotional suffering? And so I spent some time going off into architecture, not quite sure, went and studied social work for about a year and a half, worked in a therapeutic prison, and at some point realized a lot of people in the profession were drawn to it because they were very wounded.
Yeah.
And I recognized that in myself, that I was very wounded, and I thought this is not the place from which you try to help people. So I found myself coming back into architecture and going off and doing that for about 20 years.
Okay.
But then there was 15, 20 years-ish. It varies because I spent quite a bit of time in school before that. But then as I was approaching 40, my mother got very ill. She got cancer. And, it took her about 7 years to die, but in particular the last year or two. And when she died, the wheels came off my life. The stuff that I had been kind of pushing into the side and sort of saying, no, tiptoeing past, just couldn't be pushed off anymore. And I got really depressed. To the point where I couldn't think straight. I couldn't choose a cell phone plan. My mind was really that affected by the grief. And that triggered a lot of stuff that had to be faced. So there was about 3 years there where therapy was like a part-time job.
Right.
Therapy, yoga, meditation, hypnosis, various other forms of, spiritual healing and stuff. And on the back of that, I I kind of rethought what I was doing with my life and kind of came full circle back to the psychology thing and started retraining as a psychotherapist.
Right.
So that's what sort of brought me back. And then in the middle of all that, there were other experiences. I had sort of three experiences of the veil dropping and sort of seeing a bigger dimension of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And the first was actually the year after I left university. I had a grant to travel and study for a year. And it was a self-directed project. And I was traveling around Greece, reading Greek myths in a kayak.
Right.
Sort of trying to recreate an ancient experience of being, on the water and dealing with the forces and the elements and reading the myths. And I had an experience in an olive grove one night where the veil dropped and I, how to describe it? I'm lying up looking up the Milky Way, and I've never really seen the Milky Way. So I mean, I'm just seeing this amazing river of light across the heavens, and in like an instant, I'm not looking up, I'm looking down.
Right.
I'm like this little insect stuck to the side of the planet, looking down into the universe. And I realized that if the planet let go, I would fall forever. And then an instant later, I'm like, I have like a God's eye view. I mean, somehow my awareness is way, way, way away. And I'm just aware that I'm this little tiny speck of consciousness on this pebble with a smear of life on it, whizzing through this immeasurably large space. And then I have this thought, I'm alone and I'm going to die.
Doesn't sound terribly upbeat.
No, it was terrifying. It was completely terrifying. And that sort of kicked off about 20 years of meditation, Tai Chi, yoga, anything I could. Lots of reading, lots of study, mystical work, science, trying to fill that experience of I'm alone and going to die. And then 20 years later, I had a very different experience when I was doing all the therapy stuff around my mother's death. I was working with a spiritual healer one day. And again, I'm in her room, and all of a sudden the veil drops, and I see the room is full of angels. Angels the size of my thumb, to angels as tall as the room itself, to every size in between. And I'm not from a religious background. This was not the kind of iconography or imagery that would come to me. I just suddenly became aware that what I thought of as empty space was just full of an extraordinary density and variety of presences.
It's quite something. Because
completely mad.
Well, it's something a little different, all right. And this is sort of one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Was you get remarkable results for your clients who have often tried various modalities of coaching or even therapy before. And this is one of the things, even just when you were talking there, a lot of people will be listening to it sounding like, oh, it sounds like, did you have any herbal substances beforehand? But oddly enough, that takes me into the next question, which, the last few years there's been an awful lot of research into psychedelics in therapy. I mean, not least from Johns Hopkins University. There's a whole department on it now, and they're leading the way. And it has profoundly impressive results on everything from PTSD to addiction to therapy-resistant depression and whatnot. And from what I've heard and read about it, it's all of them seem to do is turn off what neurologists call the default mode network, which is essentially the inner voice, and often for people in distress, the inner critic. Mm-hmm. A lot of people report similar experiences of saying things like, oh, I finally was able to hear and feel my truer self, and this critic was sort of separated or turned completely off for a while, and you can hear nearly your truer voice and your truer self, which isn't in any way judgy and is full of much more acceptance and general love and positivity and good things. And people, they describe these experiences on the same level as when their child was born. That level of profound, perspective shift, and it lasts as well. You come back to them years later, and they've stayed moved in that perspective. And I just would love you to talk about that for a minute, in the sense of, is that also where the shamanism brings you, maybe from a different direction, but is it also, in effect, shutting down that noisy self-critic and all that busy mind, and being able to see sort of a truer self? Is it a similar thing?
They're definitely related and overlapping. I think in order to answer that, from the way I understand it, a lot of people are wondering, well, what is shamanism? People have heard the word, but what is it? Shamanism is really quite simple. It's the original form of culture. That if you go back far enough in your ancestry, you'll come to a time and a place when your ancestors lived in a world that was shamanic, in a world that was full of spirit, where it was understood not as a thought thing, but as an experience.
Right.
That everything that was alive. The trees were alive, the rocks were alive, the water was alive, the mountains was alive, the earth was alive, you were alive, animals were alive. Everything had spirit. And that you can sort of connect with and work with that. And, that's what fairy tales are about. Moses talking to a burning bush is a shamanic experience.
Right. I mean, the original art, the cave paintings, shamanic experience. They don't do them at the front of the cave. They tend to be right the way back where it's pitch dark. Yeah.
Yeah. So it, originally culture, we had this, and if you go back, the great mother, the great goddess cultures all seem to be coming out of this, and the cave art for this sort of stuff goes back 30, 40, 50,000 years. That seems to be the way we started. And then out of that is shamanism as a set of techniques, a set of methods for altering your consciousness so that you can communicate with these other dimensions of reality. This is where ayahuasca and the other plant medicines and things come in. That shamanism today is sort of divided into wet shamanism, using plants, using the plant medicines,
right,
which is, in a sense, a minority phenomena, because the plants, they don't exist everywhere in the world. They exist in quite a bit, quite an abundance in the jungle. But you get up into Siberia and Lapland and the tundra and the Eskimo places and other parts of Africa, although Africa has iboga, which is also very, very powerful. I mean, that's getting probably a little bit too complicated. But so it's a set of methods for altering consciousness. And sometimes you do it with a chemical. Sometimes you do it with a ritual, with a practice. The most common tool is a drum or a rattle or something like a didgeridoo. These all create a rhythmic, monotonous hum that entrains the brain. Now, another way of looking at it is that I did a lot of my training with Michael Harner. He's an American anthropologist who kind of revived shamanism. He was studying shamanic cultures in the late 50s, early 60s. And he's perhaps the first white man to do ayahuasca.
Right.
Because he was studying an ayahuasca tribe, and the shaman said, if you want to understand it, you have to do it.
Makes sense.
So that's that. So as I said, ayahuasca plant medicine that's the wet end of shamanism versus the dry end.
Right.
One way of understanding what you're doing there is, because I often get clients who ask me, what's your opinion on ayahuasca? And I said, it's an extremely powerful tool, very valid tradition. In terms of actually using ayahuasca, there's three issues. The quality of the plant material that the substance is brewed from, the skill of the brewer, whether they actually know what they're doing or not.
Right.
and the dosage.
Yeah,
You know,
there's a lot of variables in there.
So there's a lot of variables there. Then the other issue is, one way of thinking about our consciousness is that your consciousness is a little bit like that big warehouse at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Right, yes. Yeah.
You know, it's big and it's full of stuff.
Right.
And we normally walk around our consciousness with a very small flashlight.
Right.
You know, and we move around with what we can see in the flashlight. And ayahuasca, LSD, and things like that is a little bit like going in and turning all the lights on at once.
Right.
And some people are prepared for that experience and some people are not.
Okay.
So with sort of and again, the last training I was at with Michael, somebody asked him, you know, what's your opinion of ayahuasca, since, you know, he was like the original guy and he's actually written, you know, a very scholarly book on the subject. And his comment was very interesting. He said, why don't you learn the universe before you blow it up? And so my experience has been, you know, working with clients, working with students, with groups and stuff, teaching people how to journey, how to alter their consciousness at will and go into these other dimensions, go into these altered states. You work with spirit helpers. So that's basically like you get to meet the manager of the warehouse and he takes you around with a much bigger torch and he knows where everything is.
Right. Right. That makes some sense. And just to interject for 1 second on that, where you were talking about the different, you were alluding to the different brain levels, and it was something I mentioned earlier that, you know, you work with people. One of the things you help with is improving or gaining peak performance. And this reminds of, you know, Stephen Kotler, the Flow Genome Project, where they've amassed a huge amount of research in the last number of years. But he always talks about, you know, beta level. For those who don't know, beta is where we're just chatting and you're thinking very much with your rational mind, regular daytime stuff. Alpha is when you're dropping deeper. It's sort of light meditation or meditation level. And then, as I said, theta is usually associated, as you said, with coming in and out of sleep, but it's very deep. But when you're in a flow state, which is basically high performance, is a flow state, is when you're super focused and you lose sense of that time and you're bringing all of your resources to bear on whatever it is you're doing. You're on that deep alpha, and often, as he says, you're touching into theta. So when you're talking about these changes in state, is that what you're doing? Again, we're using slightly different language with the shamanic practices, but it's a similar principle of dropping into deep alpha brainwaves. Would that be accurate? Or
well, you're not dropping into alpha that I'm aware of. What I'm aware of is that the major tool in, you know, say the, you know, dry shamanism is this very dull, monotonous drumming that goes on in the background, and that's actually a theta rhythm. It's 3 to 6 cycles a second. And what the shamans discovered, you know, after you know, with thousands, if not tens of thousands of years of, you know, field research, is just when you have that steady, monotonous drumming going in the background, it allows interesting things to start happening in the brain. And I think what we've seen is that is a theta rhythm. And as you said, we don't normally, we pass through theta as we're going in and out of sleep. And that steady drumming allows the brain to anchor in that theta state.
Wow.
And then once the drumming is going, once you're anchored in that state, this sort of internal ability to have visions, to visit other dimensions, or what you experience as other dimensions,
right,
is there. And it's in that altered state, in that dimension, where you get access to information, to answers, to capacities that are latent in all of us. And so there's a number of different ways of saying how this happens. I mean, because one part of the work that I do is essentially getting the static and the distortion out of the nervous system, so you can have, in a sense, in an electronic sense, a clear flow of signal.
Right.
So that's the more healing side of the work, is that, and I think, and this is where we get into trauma. I think it's only now we're starting to understand how prevalent trauma is in our culture.
Absolutely.
And how it's at the root of addiction problems. It's at the root of depression in some instances, not all.
It's, as I said, that was that fantastic book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
From the American psychiatrist.
Gabor Mate.
And incredible how he was saying, working in high security prisons, like violent offenders, it is statistically impossible nearly to find someone who didn't have severe childhood trauma. Again, it's one of these key events. Not that everyone who has trauma is going to end up in prison, but when you don't have other things in your life going in certain directions, or an otherwise helpful environmental factors, you can very easily go into these disastrous cycles.
Well, and that's the ACEs study. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Okay.
It's done in I think it was the late 80s in Kaiser Permanente, a big HMO in California. And they were looking at 18,000 of the HMO members. And so, given the way America's structured, if you're in an HMO, it basically means you're middle class or better, you're employed, you're probably well educated.
Right.
So these are not people coming from, quote, bad backgrounds.
Okay.
And what they were screening for was 10 different things: physical neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, alcoholism, mental illness, disruption in the home, and I think incarceration.
Right.
And they were stunned to discover that something like 70+% of these people from good backgrounds had at least one of these traumatic things in their childhood. But I think close to 40% of them had 4 or more.
Wow.
And when you get to the level of, 4 or more, the prevalence of things like, here it is. Yeah, so this is a little thing that I created, a little handout on this. Yeah, so it's addiction in the home, drugs and alcohol, mental illness in the home, depression, psychosis, and so on. Physical, emotional neglect, absent parents, divorce, abandonment, or illness, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, parent in jail, led to a 7 to 30 times more prevalence of things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, suicide, alcoholism, strokes, and early death.
The body keeps the score.
Yeah, very much so.
These things manifest, right?
So I think we're starting to really understand that trauma is much more prevalent in our culture, in people's childhoods, which creates a lot of difficulty in I'm getting zapped by the sun.
Sure.
Which leads to a lot of difficulty. I think what's the best way of describing it? Trauma is not so much what happened. It's the emotional scar tissue that's formed around the event that constricts and limits the person's ability to function, to be flexible.
That's fascinating, because this is just to compound that point and putting things together here. There was a study done on children in New York, particularly children in Manhattan, after 9/11, and why some of them had PTSD and other traumatic symptoms afterwards, and others didn't, and what was the difference. And what became very clear very quickly was that how the parents acted. It's not to blame the parents, it's just how they happen to act. Generally, when the parent gave some sense of agency to the child, that they were involved in, like, oh, run and, you know, grab your bag and grab your teddy and grab whatever. When they were able to be more involved in the process of making themselves safe, and the parent was, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And it seemed like there was some sort of a plan or some sort of a less panic, that there was a slightly more sense of control, and we'd be okay, stressful as it was. They didn't develop symptoms of trauma or PTSD, these kind of things. But when there was a sense of panic and a sense of out of control and no agency, no sense of control over anything, they tended to develop trauma. So it's very much what you were saying. It's not just the event, it's how that's encoded in the story or the explanation of the event.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, that, you know, the Buddhists sort of talk famously about, you know, with our mind we create the world, you know, and this is where all the mindset people get off, is like, you know, change your thoughts, change your reality. That's very true, and it's limited in the sense that, yes, with our mind we create the world, but first the world created our mind.
Exactly.
You know, that what you experience from birth through the age of sort of self-reflection and awareness is going to sculpt and shape your nervous system, your reactions, and your beliefs. It doesn't mean they're fixed.
Certainly not.
But it means they've been shaped in a particular way. And I think that's what a lot of you know, therapy is about, is trying to understand the shaping and to redo it. You know, in some cases it's reparenting.
Reparenting is a big thing these days, absolutely. But it's also echoing, as you say, that the Buddhist statement very much echoes, you know, the Western history and Stoicism. That route of cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness are often these days taught as sort of the other side of a similar coin, with that idea of, you know, it's not the event, it's our thoughts on the event, or it's our mind on the event, if we want to expand that. And I've often felt that way. I mean, I even lectured in cognitive behavioral coaching, the coaching offshoot of CBT. And even though I knew that much to do that, now it's one of my go-to in the toolbox, if you will, working with coaching clients, you often do get to, and often it's very effective. But equally, there's a minority of times, a significant minority, where it just doesn't quite take hold. And I've discussed this with a number of other coaches, many who are far more experienced than I am. And we all sort of say, geez, maybe we need to train as therapists to help people go that bit deeper. But this is what's interesting, is that because when you were talking before about you talking about how you had a personal crisis, you mentioned in 2008, and you had to revisit a lot of these things, and how you had the distinct feeling that therapy wasn't the right tool for the job. I'm using my language here.
Yeah.
And you needed something else, something deeper. And like we were talking about, this complete, I'll use the word spiritual change, but state change. Can we talk a bit more, dive into that? We were going that direction anyway, but I just wanted to mention that how do you know which tool is right for the job, so to speak? Can one, or do you have to sort of try it? And
at this point, the way I work is I'm using all the tools.
Gotcha.
That and you know, a very simple way of sort of describing kind of what I do is you know, a client comes to me and some part of their life is not working, and it's either something like they've reached a certain level and they know and they're aware, I want to go higher, and yet I don't quite know what to do. You know, so one strand are the people who, you know, they're actually quite successful, but in Marshall Goldsmith's term, what got them there is not gonna move the needle.
Gotcha.
So it's like, you know, or it's like that scene in Jaws. You know, we're going to need a bigger boat, and they've realized I need to be a bigger me.
Right. It's an interesting way to put it.
So that's one end of the spectrum, is like, yeah, I need to be a bigger me. And then there's the other end of the spectrum is some kind of. I had a meditation teacher who used to ask me, how loud does it have to get? And they've had, the universe has hit them with a 2x4 of some sort.
Right.
Pay attention, dummy. There's something going on. So whatever it is, So what they've become aware of is that something's not working. Either they can't reach that next level, or they're at a level and they feel that they're blocked, they're stuck, they're frozen, they're afraid, whatever it is. And the way I sort of describe it as that there's something going on in your nervous system, in your neurology, that is blocking your ability to move, to think, to create, to whatever. So the first part of the process is to remove whatever it is blocking.
Right,
and that's sort of a psycho-spiritual process. It's not purely psychological.
Okay.
And it's not purely spiritual.
And it's going back to this idea that our psyches are built, our whole probably biology is built, not particularly to thrive as such, but to survive. And sometimes they're not mutually exclusive, but
yeah,
often they can be.
I think the way I describe it, this actually comes into the therapy model I was trained in, the Human Givens model, which basically posits that we are here because our ancestors survived.
Absolutely.
And so what that means is for tens of thousands of years and hundreds, if not thousands, actually probably millions of generations, one ancestor made it to the next, first as amoeba, and then as little critters, and then as apes, but what that means is that when we're born, we come in ready to thrive. We come in with a set of emotional, social, physical, spiritual needs wired into our nervous system. We come in with all sorts of genetic potential. We come in with capacities for meeting our needs. Memory, the ability to form bonds, curiosity, imagination, logical brain, metaphoric brain. We have all these abilities. And ideally, we're also born into a culture and a family that gives us everything else we need to activate that potential.
Okay.
And I think this is where a lot of people are having difficulty, is that either they're born into a family that's stressed, dysfunctional, or otherwise not working very well, or they're born into a culture that's also crazy making, because our culture is crazy making.
Do you mean modern Western culture, or do you mean?
Well, I think modern Western culture is kind of an extreme example in certain ways, but I also think that most indigenous cultures look at all modern cultures, and they see us as crazy. Because, the heart of sort of the indigenous experience is that we are all connected. We are all one. Everything. There's no such thing as, the Garden of Eden being thrown out of. That whole story that's at the basis of Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and before that showed up in Babylon and stuff. That's a relatively new idea in sort of human thought. It's only 4,000 or 5,000 years old,
right?
And it's a very alienated one, and they do not experience the world as being threatening or dangerous, or they experience the world as being something where we're all connected, and we
right.
So I mean that's quite a different thing. But in terms of just the day-to-day strains of,
well, just to say it is and it isn't, because when you have an acceptance that you weren't thrown out of paradise and that there's a promise of getting back into it if you play your cards right, and where you think, it is how it is out there. Yeah, things are dangerous, but they're also fantastic or plentiful at times. it sets up one's psyche of expectations in a very different way.
Yeah. No, I think in some sense it's an incredibly fundamental question, but
Yeah,
it's also a very
absolutely.
big one for the podcast.
And it's just interesting because you mentioned when you were in architecture, you were very in the ecological side, and it kind of taps back into that you
Oh
know,
yeah, I
'cause
mean
I'd
I mean
heard that
that's
shamanistic approach from.
yeah. No, I mean the thread between all these apparently disparate things
Hmm.
is how do we live in harmony and balance with ourselves, with each other,
With our environment.
with the
Yeah,
planet.
exactly. So just going, because we did go off on a very fun tangent there for a minute. Just looping back, because you were talking about how you were working with your clients, and a lot of your clients are, if you look at their, if you ever see their LinkedIn profile, they're quite impressive people. Yet, as you said, they have these severe blockers. They have something stopping them or making their lives far less enjoyable or full of contentment as it might be. So talk us through how you work with them, and a lot of them, as I said, have tried coaching or therapy or other modalities that have worked a little bit, but not solved whatever issue is they're suffering with. So what is different about you? What process do you move them through?
Well, one of the ways I describe it, the model I use is to sort of say, imagine your life is like a mill pond,
Okay.
and everything that's ever happened to you is a stone being thrown into that pond. So every event, creates a splash and a ripple. And some of the stones are very small and some of the stones are very big.
Right.
And over time, this pattern of splashes and impacts and ripples creates the surface of the pond, creates how turbulent or smooth your current experience is. And so depending on what modality you're using, they have different stances to what to do. So I think your classic kind of coaching approach says, well, forget about the past. Don't worry about it. It's over. Let's just set a direction, set a goal, and start swimming.
Okay.
And maybe we need to work on your technique.
Right. To swim better, faster, more efficient,
Yeah,
whatever. Okay, yeah.
And a short-term therapy approach similarly would say, let's focus on goals, let's focus on outcomes, and maybe we need to work on your fear of water.
Right.
Release your fear of water. A long-term therapy approach might say, well, we need to study the pattern of the ripples and map back and figure out where the splashes were and where the big ones were and where the small ones were.
Okay.
And I think the assumption there is that once you get a picture of what happened, somehow it magically fixes itself.
Right. Once you know the
once
root
you
of this trauma or this
once you have
difficulty.
insight. And I think that's because I spent quite a few years doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where there's a bit of a question mark what happens there. And this is a very broad generalization. Mm-hmm. A more meditative approach would say, well, you need to sink below the surface of the water, get away from the turbulence, go into the depths, and then you'll be fine. Or the more fluffy end of the sort of the woo-woo's end of the Enlightenment, New Age, is
Right.
you rise above it.
Right. Right.
But both of those run the danger of you're just disassociating. There are different ways of numbing out. They're perhaps less destructive than shooting up.
Right.
But you're still kind of using the technique to deny the experience or dull it. You're not resolving it.
Gotcha.
Now, there's definitely a strand of meditation that is all about sinking down into the essence of your being and into who you really are and dissolving everything. And then the shamanic is really more, you ask something bigger and wiser than your normal self. for help. And it goes to the biggest splash, the biggest stone. And in ways that are hard to describe, but once you've experienced them, it's like, holy shit. You actually remove the stone.
Wow.
You remove it from time and space. You remove its impact so that that turbulence is no longer radiating out in your pond.
Right.
And the way I work with people is we kind of work with all of those things. I mean, we do sit down and figure out what are your goals, where are you headed for, what's getting in the way. We do work with meditative techniques for calming the mind. We do a little bit of history taking and figuring out the patterns. But the heart of it is using that, touching in with something bigger, something wiser, your unconscious mind, your higher self, and beyond, to find where that big stone is and remove it and remove its impact.
Right.
And I think that's where you can reach those methods with talk therapy. It just takes a lot longer.
Yeah. And one of the big things with talk therapy is that rapport and trust between therapist and client.
Yeah,
which
well, that's true of
often
anything.
It can't be a good fit. So. But as you said, it can take months or years to do that. So, I mean, to continue that analogy, when you remove one or two of those particularly big stones, does that often solve the problem for your clients, and then they're free to grow or evolve or expand? And this is where we're talking about high performance, that these people are performing at pretty high level anyway. But as you said, to really harness their abilities and their insight and get tremendous results at the next level, they need those things to be removed. Does that usually free them, or is there further steps or further?
It depends on the situation. Bizarrely enough, a lot of my clients are executive women, which is very strange because, in this lifetime, I have been neither of those things.
Right.
But many of them come to me because of sort of glass ceiling, bullying, power abuse situations in the workplace.
Okay, so there's often an abusive element, even if it's mild, just about on the side of legal. Well,
just bullies are no different than sexual predators. They know who they can do this with.
Right.
There was a horrible story that I learned from actually Gabor Mate. I did his training in compassionate inquiry, and there was an OBGYN who was brought up for molesting his women patients, and had been for years, and he had. And there were like huge numbers of his patients who said, I had no idea he was always the perfect gentleman with me, very respectful, very this, very that. But there were other ones, and basically, like any kind of a predator, he knew people who were vulnerable.
Right.
He knew that, and just in the same way that child molesters, they have a sort of a radar for children who are from families that are not paying attention to them.
Wow, that's disturbing. As I've heard this before with psychopaths, that psychopaths have been shown videos just of people walking through shopping malls, and they have to choose sort of who do you naturally target as a victim for whatever horrible thing they want to do. And they invariably, scary consistency of picking the ones who had been, as you said, abuse victims rather than the ones who hadn't.
Yeah,
and
so I
still haven't worked out exactly what they spotted, and they couldn't often enunciate what it was.
It's not conscious. No,
it's not conscious.
But it's just it's a predator prey relationship. So there's a certain knowledge of, this is what I realized is that the reason a lot of these women were coming to me was because of their trauma history.
Okay.
And because of the fact that I have a trauma history and I've done a lot of work on it.
Right, of course.
And so step one is to release, the memories, the experiences, the beliefs that are sort of attracting or magnetizing is not quite the word, but when your energy changes, you're no longer a target for the bullies. So in one sense, they just find that the bullies kind of disappear.
Yeah.
So that can be one level of problem solving. But then the other one, the more high performance one, that gets back to Nicola, one of my favorite clients, who came to see me because things were going really well. I mean, PhD from Cambridge, 15 years climbed up through the ranks, had gotten her lectureship, had her research team, millions in grant money to solve important problems.
Right.
So she was great, feeling wonderful, but a little overwhelmed by all the opportunities, all the choices. And so this was a sense of, I need to be a bigger me.
Right.
But at the same time, she was also having kind of a spiritual crisis, that there was a part of her that was waking up to, like a more mystical side of her. And she didn't know what to do with this mystical side, because the physicist was terrified that if the mystic got outed, she'd lose all credibility.
Right.
In this rational scientific world.
Absolutely.
And the mystic is saying, we have to quit physics and become a yoga teacher.
Right.
And she was literally being torn apart by these two demands. And so we worked together for about 6 months and integrated the two. So she was very happily being mystical, using the shamanic techniques for going into other dimensions of reality. And when she's on these meditative states, she's having these experiences where she's talking with the spirit of Einstein and Tesla about her research.
Right.
And she's meeting with, quote, the spirit of the materials.
Right.
Her lab is researching, and she's coming back with insights, little diagrams and thoughts.
It's always interesting to me, because is that we're talking about going theta level brain, which is associated often as we go in and out of sleep. And it's often when we're very creative, when we wake up as we're dozing off, where the brain is working very interesting ways. But, the subconscious, for those who aren't aware, the subconscious tends to work in metaphor. So I just love these metaphors. Well, I went to talk with Tesla. If you have particular respect for Tesla, he'd be a great one to get advice from that part of your psyche, to tell you things that you mightn't be listening to otherwise. Yeah, very cool.
Well, I think there is this image of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. I forget his name. It's one of the popularizers, and he draws this picture of, sort of says, it's like the elephant and the elephant driver, that your conscious mind is the little guy sitting on top of this big elephant.
Uh-huh.
And the elephant has all sorts of desires and memories and history and experiences, and the driver is doing his best to steer the elephant. I think that's an accurate picture, but it doesn't go far enough. I think our unconscious is not an elephant. It's a blue whale. Right. And it's in the ocean, where it's connected and communicating with all the other blue whales. That's Jung's collective unconscious.
Right.
So that our unconscious is even bigger than we think it is. And it's even more connected than we've perhaps previously thought. Because I've had experiences of seeing and getting information about stuff that I shouldn't know, and my clients similarly. That they'll Nicola's getting these insights into the work her lab is doing. Corporate clients will get insights into a big spreadsheet model that's not working, a division that's having difficulties, a project that's not working, and to the point where using these insights, they turn dead in the water things into successes. And if you go into the I forget, I think it's the Dogon, one of the sort of shamanic peoples in Africa. Many of them talk about, actually the Bushmen also speak about, they don't learn anything here. They learn everything by going to classrooms in the sky.
Right.
That all the knowledge is held somewhere up there, and that's where you go get it.
Right. How long does this process usually take when you're working with clients, from being stuck and they come to see you for whatever reasons, as you said, there's something that they want resolved, to feeling that they have a resolution of sorts, and that, or a certain level of freedom or answers or whatever that might be. And then, as you said, so often, I mean, I've read your testimonials, they're extremely impressive. There are extraordinary results happening. And I mean, is it a similar track for most people, or some people take a lot longer, some people a lot shorter? How does that work?
Well, certainly the way the work has evolved now is that I now typically take people into what I call my Destiny Awakening. So there's either the Destiny Awakening, which is roughly a 3 to 6 month process,
right?
1-to-1, where we kind of figure out what the thing is that they want. What's the thing that's going to make the biggest change? Is it something around your business? Is it something around your health? Is it something around your relationships? And then that becomes the focus of the work we're doing. And then there's 6 to 12 weeks of meeting where we're just exploring the dimensions of the problem. I'm giving you little micro tasks and exercises to both agitate the situation and also start to make it better. Because I'm trying to understand what's really causing it, where the problems are. So this is a mixture of me and sort of something else, figuring out where those stones are, where those big stones are. And then we have the karmic alignment day, which is a day, sometimes a day and a half, very intense process, where that's where we clear the neurology, we clear the belief statements, and we kind of, that's where the stones get taken out. And then there's there's a follow-on process of 6 to 12 weeks of integrating the shifts, the changes. And if we haven't quite cleared everything from your neurology, we'll continue to clear it in that period. That's one trajectory. There's another one that has more to do with, that's more on the end of people who just want to kind of clear stuff and move on.
Right.
What Nicola did was she actually did more of the becoming her own shaman, stepping into her destiny work.
Gotcha.
So it's a similar process, a similar length, 3 to 6 months, but it's a certain amount of clearing, but a lot of it is also learning to develop this skill, this capacity to alter your awareness at will, change your consciousness, draw on these other dimensions of reality, other dimensions of your own awareness, and then use them effectively in your life.
I mean, so often I find with a lot of people, in one way or another, what I and what a lot of people I know in similar profession help them do is essentially get out of their own way. And what it sounds like you're doing is that at a whole other or deeper level. And as I said, being able to do it more so at will. But if people wanted to start looking down that direction, what would you recommend? So, for example, I mean, I'm, as you know, a huge fan of Joe Dispenza, who's deep meditation, and it taps into some of these abilities to gain that sort of insight. If you're into meditation, and there's a ton of research on how beneficial that is. Mm-hmm. This for me was a whole other level again. and hugely beneficial. But I just wonder, what would you recommend? Something that they can do to start, it won't maybe solve the problem, but start them looking in the right direction.
Well, I would definitely concur that any kind of meditative practice, any kind of regular thing where you sort of sit and be with yourself and allow kind of your true nature to arise is a good thing. And that's part of, that's one part of that preparatory phase in the work that I do is giving people, specific breathing practices, putting aside, and we start really small. Initially it's like a minute of breathing practices in the morning when you wake up and a minute before you go to bed, and then the second week it's 2 minutes, because it's grooving it in. That's important. It's not, if you try to say to someone, okay, starting tomorrow, I want you to do 20 minutes of meditation in the morning and 20 minutes at night. That's not going to last.
No.
But as you start to have this experience of what it's like to breathe and calm your nervous system down, because in many cases people have spent 20, 30, 40 years being scared, and running. And there are a couple of, there's some very simple techniques. I mean, one of them is the Ha breath, where you breathe in through your nose, and then you just make a sound, and just do that. I mean, that helps to make a connection between your conscious and unconscious mind. It strengthens the connection. Another one that's actually being taught in a lot of business schools is what I call be like a dog. Actually, no, I call it cats and dogs. Be like a dog gets too many Snickers. Cats and dogs, just yawn and stretch. And even if you have to fake it, just
it's infectious. Yeah.
Well, it's not only infectious, but brain scans show that just yawning a few times seems to push like a reset button in your nervous system.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's why you see cats and dogs yawning and stretching all day long.
Yeah, they do it a lot. That's true.
Yeah. And especially if you do like a very, very slow neck roll. One of the reasons it's important to do it very, very slowly is it allows your brain to notice where the stiffness and the tightness is. And once it's noticed it, it can say, calm that down. But if you do it too fast, you don't notice it. So again, that's why, cats and dogs do this very languorous
Stretching. Yeah.
stretching. They're not stretching athletically. They're stretching sort of consciously.
Very cool. Very cool.
So I'd say, those are two things that I often teach people. I always teach people to do is to, just develop the breathing practice and the, yawn stretch thing. Just, it takes less than a minute, 30 seconds. Do it, a couple of times an hour. And again, the research shows that if you do this 2 or 3 times an hour all day long, in certain respects, in terms of relaxation, it's equivalent to a meditation practice.
Wow.
It will not give you the kind of the awareness benefits in the sense of, the Buddhists or the people who use meditation for those purposes. It's not going to do that. But in terms of the physiological calming the nervous system down benefits, it will.
Excellent. Excellent. So if people want to learn more about you, Andrew, where is the best place for them to check you out?
Well, I'd say just go to my website, andrewwayfinder.com. There's going to be a quantum healing energy meditation up there that it's about 12 minutes long, and it's a visualization that just energizes the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, and the spiritual body, and kind of lines them all up.
I'll check that out myself.
And then once a month, I do kind of a demonstration where I go into how my model works and who's it for and what the process does. So, if when you get the meditation, you'll be on the mailing list for that.
Excellent. And I can
announcement to that.
Details of that will be beneath the podcast and the video. So excellent stuff. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you, Al.
Remarkable insights there. Thank you for being on the show.
Okay, cheers.
Cheers. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.